Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us wherever you may be for our final conversation in the talks program for Art Basel Hong Kong in 2022. And the fair is running right now. So I encourage everyone to check out the online viewing link if you can. It is such an honor for us to welcome to this conversation Leonor Antunes, the artist who will be in conversation with Tim Marlow, director of the Design Museum in London. And they will be talking about Antunes' first commission in China, Discrepancies with A, which was created for Daiguo Guangzhou. And this conversation is staged in partnership with Swire Properties. So thank you so much for joining us, Tim and Leonor. We're delighted to have you. Just a little bit of housekeeping for our audiences. We have simultaneous translation available. You can find the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. And we also encourage you to drop in some questions if you have them. There's a function here. We'll be monitoring the Q&A box throughout the talk. So please drop them in good time. So without further ado, Tim, Leonor, I leave it to you. Thank you so much.
Stephanie, thank you. And Leonor, good to see you across the digital sphere. I'd like to go quite quickly into specific works, and particularly the most recent commission in Guangzhou, and look at how you work in different spaces, different contexts. But I just wanted to ask you at the beginning, this might come slightly left field, but you were educated in Portugal and in Germany. You have a studio in Lisbon, but you're now in Berlin mainly. That's where you are now. When did you first know that you wanted to be an artist?
So thank you all for hosting us and for this conversation. Well, I don't know how to answer that question, because I think, like I was always interested in, since as a child, my parents are not artists, like my father is still very interested in cinema. So that's something he really invested in our kind of education, and, really good cinema, really good music. And, but Portugal was in the 70s when I was born, which just came after the revolution. So I was born right after the revolution. So, and my parents, my mother worked in hospital. She was a doctor, my father an engineer. So they were interested in culture always. But, Portugal, before 74 was in a dictatorship. So a lot of things were censored, and it was a very isolated country. It still is. Situations have been changing a lot there, but geographically it's a very, kind of peripheral country situated in Europe. So I think I was always eager to see things, hear things. And so I think, since a young age, I knew I wanted to do something related with culture in general, and in particular with, visual arts. So I don't know how to answer that question in particular, but I think it was, it was part of my understanding of the world to be able to, do something with my own, projection of it. And working with visual arts is the way I found more interesting and relevant for me to do. I couldn't see any other thing of me doing it,
I ask quite a few artists because, and often people say, I used to make art as a child, but I knew I didn't have facility or talent, or I knew that wasn't where I would end up. It didn't feel vocational or a compulsion. But once you make a decision to go to art school, presumably it isn't inevitable that will determine the rest of your life, but it's a fairly strong commitment, isn't it, to say that when at a university age, you're going to go to art school. But what interests me about your approach to art is that you talk about the cultural landscape when you were a child, is how wide-ranging your references and interests are. So I wondered whether you ever thought when you were at art school about training to be an architect, for example, whether it was visual art was always going to be the way through which you would explore the world, or whether architecture ever interested you as a potential career.
No, Portugal has quite a lot of architecture importance, so to say. I think it's has a really good schools in architecture, especially two schools, one in Porto, one in Lisbon, which are very important. And the visual arts schools are not interesting in my point of view, but I never wanted to be an architect. And I'm interested in architecture, but it's as I'm interested in clothes and I'm not interested in fashion, you know, I'm interested in figures and people that have been working with space, particular, you know, female artists or designers or people that are kind of merged out of the mainstream during, after basically after the war. And this idea also of migration, you know, this that you're able, the only way you could produce your work was by traveling outside of your country and have the conditions to work outside the place you were born. And with me was, you know, I always felt Portugal at the time was still very difficult for me to stay there and do my work, because nobody at the time was traveling to Portugal to see artists, and you know, the country really didn't have, it's a poor country, didn't really have the means to invest, you know, in artists to be able to travel abroad. And you know, so this was something since young age I really understood I had to, you know, start traveling in order to be able to continue produce my work. And but I was never interested in working with architecture. I always wanted to work with sculpture. This is and my interest in space has to do with my interest in sculpture. It's not in you know, as many other things I'm interested in, not just architecture, design, and you know.
Let's look at the most recent manifestations of your sculpture in space. So this is the commission for Swire Properties in Guangzhou, a space I think you've not actually visited because of lockdown. You weren't able to travel. Is that true?
Yes, so this was actually the first time I've done, this was during the pandemic, you know, when everything started. And so they commissioned me to make a project for this space. And they have seen a sculpture that I've done. I think before this commission, I had participated in an exhibition in London at the Barbican. And where I've done a very similar sculpture, I mean, much smaller scale, of course. And they were very interested. I worked in several propositions for the space, although for me it was kind of complicated to, you know, not to go there and see the space in real and think, because my process, part of it, not everything, but I mean, let's say 10% is very intuitive as well. So I really need to be in space and understand, you know, scale and what I can do there and how things can exist in that space. And in this case, as I couldn't travel, I thought starting from a sculpture that I've done, which is called Discrepancies with A. And so it's several strings, let's say, made of brass, made of very thin brass tubes. And then they have this brass wire inside. And then you connect them by knots, knotting the wire and twisting the wire. And I started to do this series of works, I think in 2000, maybe, I don't want to make mistakes now, but maybe 2014, let's say. And when I started to do these works, I was mainly the works were based on fabrics or weavings by Annie Albers, who was an artist weaver that studied at the Bauhaus, and then she and her husband Joseph Albers immigrated to the US, and they started, because of she was Jewish, so they had to leave Germany, and they were invited to go to the Black Mountain, and so they taught at the Black Mountain for a few years. And so her interest in the pre-Columbian fabrics and, you know, was something that I was very intrigued by. And so I started to do this series of works based on her weavings. And they basically take the drawings of the weavings one-to-one scale. And sometimes I enlarge them, sometimes I use that scale. And I always repeat the drawing, but I repeat the drawing in terms of, you know, like using it, using this kind of pattern of the fabric as a stencil. So I reproduce it with using tubes and using wire. And then sometimes, as I say, enlarge the scale, and but it's really trying to be as close to this kind of drawing or pattern as much as it's possible. But of course, because it's not a flat work, there's a lot of empty spaces. When you hang it out, the work becomes completely different, and it has its own gravity. So you lose the reference, you completely lose the reference to the original drawing. But I like the fact that they are done, you know, we do a lot of, you know, it's just cutting tubes, washing tubes and cutting wires, and then measuring. Everything's about measuring and transporting this idea of the same measure to the pattern. But it's also this idea, which I find it interesting, this idea of working in a flat surface. You know, so the works are kind of connected on tables. So you work in a flat space, and then when you hang it, the work becomes three-dimensional. And
so you've no idea, well, I say no idea, but so that process is always a journey of revelation, because you may have an idea what it will look like when it becomes three-dimensional, but you're not ultimately able to control the detailing of that.
Yeah, but I think that's the interesting point of it. You know, it's just a process of translation. It's really a process of translation, and what happens during this translation, and when the work is hanged in space or on a wall, sometimes they are hanged on walls. It's not important how it looks like for me. You know, sometimes I don't even like how it looks like, but it's not important because it's important that the work exists, has this. For me, it's like, you know, if I cut tubes, I know, you know, I have to know exactly why I cut this dimension and why it has to be related with that specific pattern. And so for this project, that maybe we could go back to the
image, yeah.
To the images. So in this case, it's not related with it's called discrepancies with A, and A is referring to Annie Albers. So there's this, really, the title has this kind of cryptic analysis of, you know, what it refers to, because discrepancies already meaning this idea. I've done a lot of works with this title, this idea of working with something specific, but there's a kind of alteration or a non-understanding or an unlearning of that process of working with this specific, let's say, archive of this person, Annie Albers in particular. But at the same time, I don't want to be that specific. So I say A could be also any other name or any other city, or, you know, but I mean, throughout the process of this work, I think people already understand and know more or less what I'm talking about. But so in this case, I didn't, so during this time where I was producing all these series since 2013-14, with this series based on Annie Albers, where I showed, for example, the Art Basel in 2015, I showed a group of them on the wall. And there was a lot of material that was left over from all these series. And I decided to put these measures together of these different tubes that I've used for these previous works. And I decided to create something rather than working, as I said before, this flatness on tables where you kind of connect all these different measures on tables and you follow. You have always a drawing on the side to be able to know which part you're connecting. Here, we decided to work vertically. So instead of, you know, and using these different tubes that we had from these different leftovers, we decided to randomly try to, you know, assemble this idea of these measures, but working it in a vertical way instead of like working on in the flat surface.
There's a lot. Go on, sorry.
No.
Well, I was going to say there's a lot of component parts in this piece,
Mm-hmm.
but it's very distilled or stripped back, isn't it, as well?
It's very, sorry?
Distilled or stripped back.
I mean, it's, I don't know how to, I was interested in this idea that, it's a massive space. It's a circular, you walk around it. It's like has this oval shape. And normally this type of spaces, I mean, you look at shops basically, and or you sit, so I was interested in having this kind of element that, it's very discreet. Here it looks like very present, but unfortunately I haven't seen it live yet because I was not able to go to China, as it's still complicated to travel, not being Chinese, going to China. But I was interested in this idea that it's just a specific gaze in space, and it's very transparent. So we created this grid, because for me it's very important how the work, it's not just about the work in space, it's how it's suspended and how it's suspended in that room. So for me it's very important to look up and to see, then you pay attention to the building and you pay attention to certain details. And so we created this grid of with the same material, where this kind of fluid brass tubes are coming from this suspension of this particular object, which
you
is
say, you say you look up. You say you look up, and of course you do, but it's also clear that you encounter it at your eye level as you go around, yes, as you go exactly. down the levels. Do you? I mean, in a minute we'll look at pieces you've made in museums and other contexts, a house, a church. Mm-hmm. But this is a public space, a very public space. And it's quite interesting that people's navigation of or awareness of public space is fundamentally different to that in museums, where they go at least open-minded and open-eyed to see what is there. Do you confront so-called public space in a different way?
Yeah, I think so, of course, because and I'm very interested in that, because I don't think you are expected to see artworks inside of public spaces, no? Or if you do, then I've made a few works in parks and in the street, but they were always temporary works, because I think it's complicated to see art in public space, which is I mean, in history of art you have different approaches towards public space, of course. But I'm interested in this idea that, the city or the public space, if it's inside a commercial center, it's still, a public space, even though the work is enclosed, it's not in the street. But this idea that, there's a lot of movement and noises and reductions and things that happen, keep changing. I mean, in the commercial center, you have shops that open and close. In the streets, you have like the traffic and, like everything counts and everything is important. So I think at least the way for me to work with it, which is different from this space in particular, because I've done other projects outside, mainly in streets and in the city, where I think it's important to have this specific moment where you stop and you look at something that is weird or it's happening that you haven't paid attention before. Or I remember a project I did in Lisbon. I was very young, and they asked me to do this project in a very complicated neighborhood in Lisbon, which is extremely poor and very, very problematic, because it's a complicated neighborhood for many reasons. And I was very interested in that neighborhood because it really merges the link between the port and the hill. And so I did this sculpture, which was a missing part of a handrail that existed in a staircase, which I found so absurd. So I did the missing part and I put it on the other side of the street. So it's this kind of, disruptions that happen. Or once I did like in the street of Lisbon, you have a lot of tramways. So I did a fake tramway stop with, that normally you have the interiors of the trams where you have the handles for people to secure inside the tram. So I did the interior of the tram, but outside. But it was a temporary work, as the handrail was. I mean, these are very old projects, but I think it's funny to remember those now. But this idea that things exist you know, as I said, shops close and open. And so this idea that you have something from your time when you pass at that moment in a specific street or place that exists there, and after it disappears, you know, it has, for me, it was very important that the works have this temporary location and existence. And here what happens in this space is that you have this sculpture which is suspended in the commercial mall, but it's going to change because this work is made of brass, and brass tarnishes with time, so it oxidates. So what you see now is going to be different from when you look it into, you know, 6 years. It's going to be a completely different, you know, the tubes will get much darker. So you wouldn't see this shiny kind of glittering thing that it has now. So it becomes more cold and sober, and more like about this idea of drawing and lines rather than this, you know, kind of gazing with the glittering thing on
Yeah,
it.
it becomes more emphatically a drawing in space, I suppose, than something more ethereal. I'm struck by in the examples you gave of early temporary works, of the idea of turning things inside out. You know, the triangle, yes, the interior externally, and the inversion of the handrail and so on. And we just move on to the next image. The great Casa di Vidro, the House of Glass, designed by Lina Bobardi. I mean, in a sense, one of the many great things that this architect did was to sort of bring nature inside, or at least try and play with the relationship between the inside and the outside. It's such a wonderful space. I have to say, your work does look incredibly powerful there, but is it quite daunting when you're wrestling with the spaces created by someone who you clearly admire as much as you do Lina Bobardi?
Yeah, totally. You know, when Adriano invited me to do this show, he initially invited me to do the show at the Masque in the Museum of São Paulo that she also designed. And then after that, he said, would you like to do a show at the house? And, you know, this is such an important place for me. I mean, I visited many times. I lived in Brazil because I really wanted to, you know, do a little bit more research into her work. This was 2007, and then I went back 2008. I mean, this show was 2019. But so when he invited me, I felt I don't want to be, you know, an invader or an invader in space. I want to be a guest. And I wanted to respect a lot of my, you know, kind of fidelity for her work. And, you know, I really is something, I know the work quite well. I've been researching, you know, for many years, and I've spent a lot of time in this house because it's also where they have the archive. And the first thing I wanted, and I asked them, was if I can still use their furniture, because they've done a previous show. It was the second show the Masque did there. They had this kind of agreement between the foundation and the museum. So the first show was Sonia Gomez, and Sonia, she took out everything. You know, she really worked in the space as if this was like more like a gallery space, so to say, like more neutral as it can be, you know, like without the furnitures. Some pieces you cannot remove from the house because they are very heavy to transport and difficult, so they don't want to move that. But for me, I really wanted to reveal Lina as a character and her personality. So what we did was, I worked with Amanda as well, the curator, Amanda Carneiro. She was also really important here with me working on this project. So we looked into her closets. You know, we really wanted to reveal Lina as a character. And I wanted to remove the husband from the house because he was not someone I was interested in for many reasons. I don't want to have to explain here, but and he was the last one to leave because he was, you know, she died first. And the family, not the family, but the foundation, because they didn't have children. But so they have been selling a lot of works that they were major collectors. So her husband, Pietro Bardi, actually, they came to Brazil because he was an art dealer and he was invited to do a European collection for a museum that didn't exist by that time, which is today the MASP, and she designed it. So they had a lot of works, paintings in the house, which was part of the collection. And I was interested in this idea of like bringing the original displays of her furniture. So there's a lot of photographs. When the house was constructed, she had designed some of these chairs and tables specifically for the house. And she has done in the beginning a specific display with this, the house, which, I mean, we have like several periods in time where we can see the different occupations the house had, but I was interested in this kind of first moment. So the landscape was totally different. This was like a place they bought. It was an old tea plantation. So it was very dry with the years. She did the garden, she did everything. And of course, because it's in the tropics and Brazil is just this amazing, has this amazing land where everything explodes.
Fertile and flourishes, yeah.
Yeah, in like next month you put the seed and in 2-3 months it's like, you know, it has this huge plant. And so it's massive now. You have this really green occupation around the house. But when they moved in and she built this project, it was quite empty, you know, there was almost no houses around and the landscape was really inexistent. I mean, this garden, you know, that we see all these trees around, etc. And so I asked them, can I remove the curtains? Because I was interested in this dialogue with the nature. Mm-hmm. And also I was interested in looking into her clothes and the closets and bringing her collection, mainly of African Portuguese objects that she collected, you know, and also the furnitures that she did. At that time, they had another exhibition that was going to Mexico at the Jumex. So a lot of the furnitures were leaving for that exhibition, but so the furnitures that were left and they cannot be transported because they were specifically done for the house, I kept it. And then I removed everything that belonged to Pietro, like all his art collection, all his paintings. So it was really about Lina. So her presence, her books, you know, her furnitures. I placed the chairs and the tables according to the first displays of the furniture in the house. And then this feeling of being guests and not trying to, you know, add much more than what exists there, because I think it's already so subtle, this idea of like, you know, finding objects that belong to her collection. And also she loved, for example, jewelry, and she was always dressing her sculptures and putting dresses and putting necklaces. So I tried to do that in space too.
So what was the process, Leonor, here? I mean, were you making physical drawings of fragmentary forms and shapes and then turning it into a different material, metal? Or were you playing directly with sheet metal?
So yeah, here what I did was I looked into, so she designed these beautiful shelves for the house, which were glass shelves. And basically these shelves were made of steel and poles, like metal poles, and then some transparent shelving system. I don't know what happened. She designed them for the room, but they disappeared and they were broken. And so today we can't see them, but we have access to our drawings and some of the photographs. You can see this shelving system. So what I did, I was thinking about this idea of like, if I add something in space, which has to do with my understanding of which sculpture I can add into this room, I wanted to work with this idea of the verticality of these poles that exist in space. So the poles they look very much like the original from the shelving system. And so that's why the sculptures have this, they are paired in 2 groups. And they were placed exactly in the same spot as these shelves were placed in origin. And the poles, they are much more, they look very similar to these ones. I mean, mine are in stainless steel. The ones she did were in steel, but I wanted this idea of if I use metal, then metal has to be polished, so they can also actually merge inside the room, and you can have all these sort of reflexes in space, and you can see the plants through it. And then I thought, I was thinking a lot on the work of Ligia Clark, for example. She did this beautiful series of sculptures called trepantes, which mean climbers. And this idea that sculpture doesn't have support. So she did them in rubber, she did them in metal as well. The idea that sculpture doesn't have, a plinth to exist, but it's a sculpture that can be adapted as a climber. It can go up like trees, like plants, but also this idea that, you don't have a space for sculpture to exist. The sculpture can be placed somewhere, and it adapts because it's soft. It adapts to the circumstances and to the, shapes and forms where it stands. And so I was thinking a lot of Ligia as well. And so I decided to cut these spirals in metal, the same material, and we polished them as well. And here was really trying to, it's a quite aggressive work to do because the sheets are very thin, because stainless steel is very hard, no? And it's difficult to work. So the sheets are very thin, and it's cut in spiral. So it's, again, this idea of the flatness, and you take one stripe or one end of the spiral, and you try to twist it around these poles. So I couldn't, I tried to control it, but it's also out of control. It's out of my kind of, I let the material also, work by itself, because I try to do the first movements, and then I try to understand if the sculpture stands, then I let it stand. If it comes down, then I try to pull it up and work. So that's why I was trying. It was a work made on site. So I was trying to manipulate it, but also letting the material to work by itself. So it's really, so that's why some parts are very attached to the poles, and some parts are really coming out, like, it's a very performative gesture, so to say.
If we move on to the installation that you did at MASP, the museum that, as you said, that Lina Bardi also created after the house. Actually, the house was 51. This was late 50s. I mean, this is much more, I would say, controlled, but these are pre-existing works that in some ways are installed still in an open space that create spaces, but are less, relatively less fluid. Was the house therefore a reaction to wanting to break free of the constraints that were more evident in MASP, or were the two, actually, there's another example where, I mean, that's relatively restrained in comparison, but the forms still have a sense of fluidity in a life of their own. But what was the relationship between the installation here and then the subsequent project in the house?
Well, I think the house was, I mean, the shows opened at the same time, 1 week difference. And for me, being in the house was, of course, much more difficult for me to not difficult in the sense, I mean, more delicate, so to say, because the MASP was designed to be a museum, no? Yeah. Originally. And I really tried to work with the idea of, for example, the floor that exists in the MASP today, it's not the original floor she designed, because they had some problems. So in the 80s, I think in the 80s, they made some alterations. And since Adriano is Adriano Pedrosa, the director of the museum, since he arrived in the museum, he really tried to, it's amazing how he, not just him, of course, the whole team, but I mean, such a vision to bring back the figure of Lina Bardi, because the museum before him was really, I don't know, not abandoned, but, there was not so much respect towards all this, quite radicals that she did. She designed for the museum these displays with the glass where the parents kind of fluctuate in the rooms, I think everybody's familiar with her work, so I don't have to explain that. But here I really wanted to go back to this idea again of the, working with the landscape. So we removed, normally in this room in particular, you're not allowed to have this windows not covered because of insurances and the heat, But in my case, because it was just my show and I really didn't, for me, it was not important, you know, if the works can get bleached through the light, etc. So I wanted, again, this relation. This was a kind of a merging situation with the house, this relation with the exterior. So we removed all the curtains, and then we also removed the entrance way to this room. So normally this room is covered with glass and you enter through a door. And I asked them, can we, you know, keep it open, like an open space? So you kind of don't know exactly where you're entering to. And for me, this was important. Like you have this corridor where this piece is standing against the wall. For example, this was a very important moment for me, like this idea, she designed this beautiful staircase. It's like a sculpture, no? It's a staircase which is only sitting on the floor. So the weight is on the floor. And then when you go up in the staircase, this is like a floating staircase. It doesn't touch the walls. It's quite amazing, this object. So I did this piece, which was, it's a ladder that I took from a drawing by existing ladder made by Franco Albini, who was a very, you know, important figure in the life of Dina Bobardi. He was an amazing architect from Milan. I mean, Lina was, they collaborated in many projects. They were very close. And I think the works are very interesting in the beginning. They kind of merge, you know, like some of her furnitures are very similar from his furnitures. You don't know who did first. He also did a lot of museums display, which are very in relation with her idea of display and this idea of the empty space and the you know, the fluidity and this idea of transparency in space that he also explored a lot. And so I wanted to, that piece in particular with this, with the ladder, it has to do with a project, a ladder that he did for a house in Milan. So I kind of copied this idea of the ladder and everything around. Maybe we could go back to the images with this red piece. Of course, it has to do with my interest, for example, in the indigenous objects, in particular from Brazil, which a community that I visit in Mato Grosso, which is called Xingu. And so a lot of the objects that exist, a lot of the sculpture that exists in this exhibition have also to do with my interest in the way these people craft and do their crafts. And, you know, like necklaces, which have this kind of idea of the Moebius strip, where you have an endless cord, or a lot of these things that exist suspended here, which have to do with these objects that I've been collecting, and I've kind of reproducing them with other materials, changing the scale, but using this kind of same approach to how things are done.
That really interests me, that you this collection of different kinds of objects that then you translate or use as the basis for a material transformation in a different material. Do you collect material? Have you got a studio filled with different materials that you will use? Yeah. I
have boxes with things that are materials that I collect. Sometimes I don't use them, or I collect them and then it's not necessary that I've worked with them immediately, but I collect them and then I think about them within time. Or fabrics that I collect from Mexico, from, you know, pieces. For example, once I bought an amazing fabric, which was the first, again, thinking of this process of translation, I was very interested in the fact that, you know, like they, for example, in Mexico, in Oaxaca, they did these beautiful fabrics where they tried to repeat the pre-Columbian patterns, like the more geometrical patterns, but using the sewing machine. But they were really the first ones, so everything it's crazy, you know, because they can't control the machine, so they try to repeat the same patterns, but then nothing works, you know, like, because it's just the beginning of trying to, you know, it's, for me, it's a process that I think it's this idea of trying to, you know, the indigenous culture, which, you know, a lot of these communities still produce the same kind of imaginary that they did, you know, 60 years before or 70 years before. It's still, they still produce the same kind of objects, but they use, of course, today they use different materials. And they mainly do it for the tourists, and because it's the way they have to survive, right? But it's interesting that, this kind of imagery doesn't change, and I'm interested in that.
I'm interested in, I mean, it sounds that through travel, you've always been curious, you've always wanted to travel, you explore ideas, come through the process of seeing things and thinking about things. But, as we said at the beginning, you were born in Portugal, you now spend your time, I mean, you're in Berlin now, you represented Portugal in the Venice Biennale. How do you identify, or is that just a spurious question? I mean, do you see yourself as a Portuguese artist, or you just see yourself as an artist?
Yeah, I see myself from nowhere and everywhere. Citizen of the world, that's it. That's why I was so, attacked when I did the Portuguese pavilion, because I said, I have no proud to be here. I mean, I could be anywhere, and for me, it was this idea of the representation was a little bit difficult for me it was a very difficult process to do that exhibition. It was beautiful in many ways, but also very problematic, because this idea of representing something or a country or a nation, it's very complicated. And I never felt, like it's beautiful. It's interesting. The other day I was in Brussels. I had to do this small exhibition, and I met this beautiful artist called Manon de Boer. She's, I know her work since many years, and it was the first time I met her, and she told me, I was telling you about this show I'm planning for next year, and she said, oh, it's interesting because I've never seen you coming from a specific place. And I think it was the biggest compliment, someone gave it to me, because this is something I've been, working on. I don't want people to, see my work as coming from a specific, because this happens a lot with many artists, and it's also it's also what interests to some of them in particular, this idea that you can immediately recognize where they come from, or if that's important. For me, it's not important, because for me, it's really about, trying to work with different workshops, really engaged within certain ideas of craft and making, which I'm interested. So
which contemporary artists do you feel closest to?
What do you mean in terms of?
In terms of art, approach, process, artists that you regularly talk to, artists that you learn from, artists who learn from you?
Well, I do a lot of, I see a lot of shows, no? Something I'm very, I need that, and I'm curious. So I look a lot of things, I travel a lot, and but I like to, I do a lot of research in terms of archive, and I'm always interested in looking at someone's work that I haven't seen before. So for me, making an exhibition, it's also about discovering new things and new people and new places, It's really about that, trying to find something and learn something, always, taking...
So lockdown must have been particularly oppressive for you.
Yes.
In the sense that you travel and you weren't able to go and see things. What did you do in lockdown? Did you draw a lot? Did you read a lot?
So during lockdown was interesting because I had some projects that have been postponed, but I had to still work for these projects, which two of them still happen. For the one I did the show in UK and another one in Paris. And these were like quite massive projects. So I didn't want to, of course I couldn't, do a lot of these site visits and spend time in archives and looking at things. But I thought I'm going to concentrate my year in doing, working within the same kind of frame, let's say. So all the shows that I've done after that were really based on the same kind of idea. And during the lockdown, I spent a lot of time in a ceramic workshop in Lisbon. So I was working in Lisbon that year. And so I spent, I don't know, 7 months in a ceramic studio, learning I mean, I did a show where I showed all these ceramic sculptures that I did in Paris in October last year, but it was such a long process to fabricate these sculptures. You know, it was such a different process from everything else I've done. But so I found this workshop from these two ladies I know in Lisbon since many years. And I told them the only way I can, you know, work here is that I also want to learn, you know, I also want to. So we were just the three of us working on these big sculptures, crazy ceramic pieces that, you know, I didn't have much experience working with that material. For me, it was the only way I could work with it was that I could have learned working with it as well. Because originally I wanted to go to Japan and work in a ceramic studio there, but since it was not possible, I thought this was another, you know, another possibility for it to happen. It was really amazing.
How much does learning the process, how much does the process take you on the journey to realize the sculpture, and how much is your learning of the process an attempt to master something to realize an idea you already have? I'm curious about the relationship between the two.
Yeah, so I think this in this particular case was a little bit different because you can control, but you can't control much. You know, like there is always this mutual kind of how do you say compromise in the work, which is, you know, this idea that you want to build a specific object, and normally it's you know, there's not much flexibility, you know, like unless I'm working with different materials or very organic things, there's not much flexibility for it to change rather than becoming something different from what I imagine. While ceramic is really about, you know, trying to build my objects in a way that I don't want to work in ceramic in a very organic way. Let's say sculpting. I don't believe in that in my work. So there's like an understanding of the shape or the form I want to do. And it's really trying to replicate this shape that I want to make. But again, working in flat surfaces, always, this process is very similar. So I wanted to use a similar process for building the ceramic objects that I use in my other sculptures. And but then the process, because, you know, like ceramic is things can be broken in kiln during the, you know, the process of making it, you know, bake the ceramics and the glazing. So I think, you know, this is why it was interesting. So I didn't want to have this space for things to go wrong. So we let it dry for many, I don't know, 2 months. So there was almost no possibility for it to break because the pieces were quite difficult to produce. And, you know, so it was really about like expending this time working on something specific, which is, I mean, I never had this time before, going to 7 months to a ceramic workshop every day. You know, I never had this experience before. So for me, it was very interesting as a learning process, learning by doing.
I love the engagement that people have with art and space in museums. It's, you know, one of the reasons I'm in the museum world, and obviously that was all missing during lockdown. Given the research and the scrutiny with which you and the diligence with which you bring to the process of making work and installations, artists always shrug their shoulders when they're asked about audience response, because the main point is it's out of your control. But are you curious? Have you spent time looking at the way people engage with installations that you've created? And does that have any impact on how you think going forward?
I mean, I have conversations, of course, and, you know, like there's great people also that have written about my work, and it's curious for me to understand that, you know, I have a very particular way of looking at things, I think, and also how I display my work, because it's not an authoritarian. I think it's not an authoritarian way of working with space, but rather leaving you know, I give like the starting points, and then people really, you know, do their own, you know, journeys throughout the space. But I'm interested in this kind of relations that objects do with each other, you know, and the space it creates and the links between something. There's always a lot of transparency because you're looking at something, but always see something on the back or something on the side. So it's always about this kind of compromises and dialogues between things. So if the audience is paying attention to these things, great. But, you know, everybody has their own way and experience and knowledge of looking, and this is beautiful.
And people bring their own histories to the shows. You're very interested in the history of material and processes, and it's quite clear in conversation, you know, there are all sorts of historical references. There was an installation you did that I was really struck by, which was in a church in Plymouth, St. Luke's Church. We've got images of that. And I was curious about the spiritual dimension of that space and its spiritual past. And actually, art for some people is a kind of quasi-religious activity now. It's kind of replaced. How did you approach this particular space? Were you trying to push to one side its spiritual dimension and just see it as a formal space to begin with, or was that inextricably linked with the way you dealt with it?
Well, I think the spirituality comes not just from the context of the space itself, but rather this idea of the verticality, you know. It's quite high. Ascension. But then you also have this. I mean, here was an interesting process because it's a museum that opened. The museum existed, but they have been closed for a while, and now the city gave them this Protestant church for them to use as an art gallery. So when Nicoletta Lambertucci, the curator, invited me to do this project, I was opening this new space in the museum, right? Which doesn't exist in this museum space, but it's in this square, and there's this church. And so when she invited me, it was really the origins of the process. So the architects were, you know, working on it. So we were able to take out a few things that we didn't want it to be there in space, and we could do it. So that's why, you know, there's no wall in front of the room. You know, normally you would have a wall with a, you know, labeling or person sitting in front, and you would have a staircase going up through the top floor of the mezzanine. And these were things that we were able to stop. I mean, fortunately, we could control it at that level. And then I used a few elements here that I wanted to kind of see how they would look like in this space in particular, because, for example, these lamps, I've produced them in Italy, in Venice, when I did the Portuguese pavilion, and they were lamps that I produced in this Murano workshop in the city, because I was really interested in reactivating the craftsmen that exist there, because it's a city, you know, it's so rich in terms of their crafts. I mean, today these things are disappearing, of course, but still some of the workshops are there. And I worked with this workshop called Idea Murano. So these lamps are made, it's blown glass, it's Murano glass. And they were kind of merging the rooms where they were sitting. So they had different colors because the rooms all in the pavilion had different colors as well. So there was a blue room, a red room, a yellow room. So for me here was really about trying to understand how, you know, these lamps, sculptures lamps exist outside of the pavilion, you know, how, what's the relation between seeing them together or seeing them separately in different rooms, and the relations these things create within other sculptures.
And stained glass, for example.
Stained glass. So this was a window. The original window of this church had been placed in another church in the city. So they had nothing here. And originally they were invited to, their intention was to commission an artist to make a window for the church. So, and since I was opening the space, they asked me, do you want to do it? And I said, I will be honored to make it. And here was a quite nice process because so I was interested in the Cottonian collection that the museum has. They have these amazing books, you know. So I've seen one book by this artist, this kind of first female scientist called Anna Maria Civilian. She was German and she was the first person to fly to Suriname. She did these beautiful illustrations of plants and insects, mutations, transformations. And so this collector in particular that acquired these prints, so the collection is stored in furniture because some of these books are quite rare and they cannot be exposed to light. I don't know how it is today, but when I went to visit the collection, they were, so all these furnitures were displayed in their storage. And then you would have these books that this person that is in charge of the collection would, with their gloves, she would take out a few books and show it to you. And she showed me this book and it was, so the people normally that will collect these things, they would commission people to design the furnitures for their collection of books first. And then secondly, they would collect these prints in publications as well. And they would choose, the cover. Sometimes, most of the times they were covered in leather. And it shows also the end papers of this book. And I thought it's interesting to think about this collection, which is, there's a collector who collects a specific book, but then there's also an easy interference in there. And his choice of choosing this specific cover and the ending of papers that exist. So I wanted to, and because it's such a hidden collection, you will only have access if someone allows you to look into a specific book, right? And so I was interested in taking a detail of these marble papers in that book that exists in that particular book. So there's a lot of drops of, because it's quite old, so there's some drops of water. So this small, very small detail is blown up into this glass, but it's quite, it's the same process of kind of Annie Albert's, kind of sculptures, because it's a detail that it's blown up, but it's what it is, So we try to be as more close to the origins of this drawing as we could. And I worked with this. For me, it was important to work with this workshop in Zurich called Glassmeder, because they were the ones who did the Sigmal Polka Church in Zurich. Yeah. And when I visited them, that project is amazing. But, the level of craft that exists there, it's insane, and the process of translation of this work to the glass, it's really beautiful. So I really wanted to work with them. And the museum could not afford it because it's a public museum. They didn't have the budget of that project in Zurich, for example. And so this company, they lowered the price down so we could work with them because they were also interested in collaborating with us. And it was really an amazing experience because it's not a stained glass, it's fused glass. So you have several layers of glass. You merge the colors by putting layers, and then they are fused in the kiln, and then they are sandblasted. It's very sculptural. It has a lot of density of material. It's not a flat glass.
Leonor, there's a question that's come in actually that relates to particularly to this project, but actually a lot of the projects that we've been talking about, which is, do you think that the division between fine and contemporary art and design is artificial, or are there meaningful boundaries for you in all of that? Because you certainly blur those boundaries and traverse them, but do you differentiate between art and design?
If I differentiated, myself, I do. I differentiate it because, but I'm interested in this kind of hybridity, these connecting points that might exist. At least in my work, I had such a, classical kind of formation when I was studying, So I really didn't want to have this kind of, working in a very kind of traditional conservative way. So that's why I think my work is really you know, merging this kind of different disciplines and different things. I see the differentiation, but I'm interested in this kind of hybridity that sculpture has, you know, or it might have, like looking at, you know, a piece of sculpture that you could have this same, I mean, I'm not saying that a piece of sculpture is more important than a piece of furniture. For me, it's, you know, the same kind of labor and, you know, conceptual work that exists behind could be exactly the same. But I think there are differences in terms of processes and how things are done for. But the level of investment, I think, could be the same as equal. And I'm interested in, again, this hybridity of, you know, looking at a sculpture, you might look at a piece of furniture or a beautiful fabric or...
What about finish? Because actually furniture or designed objects, there is a process that involves, you know, it's clearer for a designer when something is finished or resolved. How are you on that with sculpture? Is there an intrinsic moment or in your process where you think that is finished, or do you always feel that works are in a sort of permanent state of irresolved resolution, as it were?
Well, I think, you know, like I think sculpture has this capacity, I mean, with different, I think it's with painting is a little bit different, but I think sculpture has this capacity of, you know, the sense of transformation. And I think, you know, like my sculptures, for example, the works that I do, I tend to think about this notion of the, you know, things that I've learned also from Eve and other artists, which is the idea of the sculpture, soft sculpture and the rigid sculpture. And I try to, within these years, I try to, because now, you know, the body of work has been quite, you know, bigger and bigger. So I think, you know, I try to, you know, process of understanding how some of the sculptures can change within different circumstances and contexts and different supports. And because of the materiality of some of them and the softness that some of them have, like, I think it's possible for them to change and become something different, you know, rather than the origins of how this sculpture was placed in the origins or how it started. But I don't know if it's, I hope, you know, they have enough space that they can be understood as a continuous project rather than a finished object. I never see them as a finished, you know, object rather than something that I can continue to work from. I take ideas from that, I create other things, or I place them in different supports.
Or the fragments, as you talked about, helped inform the piece that you made, Discrepancies with in Guangzhou. Briefly, what are your next projects? What can you tell us about what you're up to next?
I'm doing so this year. I'm taking part of the triennial in Japan called Aichi Triennial, and my work will be installed in this beautiful, amazing building by Kenzo Tange. It's a building from the end of the 40s. It's quite beautiful, but I'm showing an existing exhibition. I'm putting the same exhibition there, but I mean, trying to, because I think it's a ceramic, it's this ceramic sculpture that I've done that I showed last year at Beaux-Arts in Paris, the chapel, and I'm preparing a very big exhibition in Portugal, in Lisbon, for the Gulbenkian Foundation. They have been closed for 2 years, so I'm going to open the new space, the new museum. The foundation acquired another garden, and they also modified the Leslie Martin architecture. And they asked Kenzo Kuma, I think it's his name, the architect, is changing the museum. So they are going to change a little bit that space, and they have much more garden now. So I'm doing, it's a nice project because I'm opening that new space, and or this new museum that has a new kind of shape, and which is will be much more transparent, because there's a new garden that continues the existing garden, and so the spaces are much more transparent now, or will be. And I'm also curating their collection, and this is also interesting, you know, because they have their contemporary collection and their modern collection. And so the curator asked me to also curate their collection of art, the contemporary and modern art. It's interesting.
One final question. Someone thanks you for a wonderful talk, which I concur as well. And it says, will you be able to visit us in China soon? Do you plan to go to China?
I hope so. I would love to go. And, you know, it's, I think it was the first time that I've installed and imagined a piece of mine that I haven't seen, I haven't been. We did a lot of video Zooms, you know. During installation, they were very generous and were doing it at the same time. And we worked on it together. It was a very long process. It took us, I don't know, 3 years to make this piece and to be able to, and when we were finally ready to install it, I mean, the pandemic hit and we couldn't do it, but I would absolutely love to go. And I've never been in China.
Well, I think that's a firm invitation, and I think we'd all like to hear what you your response to the work that you've created when you finally see it. that would be intriguing. Leonor, thanks so much. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. We've run over time, which is a testament to the fact that I was losing my sense of time. It was fascinating. So thank you very much, and thanks to everyone for listening.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye. Thank
Goodbye.
you. Bye.